Generations of believers and everlasting traditions. When you think of Christmas, do you think of the impact that your life makes? Do you think of the impact that your traditions have? I think sometimes we just carry on with what traditions we've always done. We just carry on with what traditions are maybe the latest fad, the latest gift that should be given. How many of you bought one of those eggs for your grandkids last year that breaks out of the egg, or was that 2 years ago? Thank goodness my kids are beyond those gifts. Every year it seems like there's something new that everybody's doing and everybody's getting and you can't find it and everybody's scrambling and fighting for it. But you know, it's some of those little things that get embedded in our minds and our hearts, and they kind of stick because it was a special moment, it was a significant moment. And I hope that this year, as we look at some of our own traditions, that we will embrace and discover ways that we can pass on our faith to future generations as well. So this year, the overarching title of this series is called Celebrating Christ This Xmas. This Xmas. Now, a lot of people get bent out of shape when you use the phrase Xmas, because you're Xing Christ out of Christmas. I've been in all the debates and all the discussions. I'm not so opposed to it, because actually the Greek word for Christ, the first letter starts with an X. It's Christos, and it starts with an X. And so, okay, it's just a shortened abbreviation. I don't care what you call it, if you call it Christmas, if you call it Christmas, if you call it Xmas, if you call it the holidays, if you call it 'tis the season. At the heart of it, if we are believers in Jesus Christ, we need to make this Advent about who? About who? Christ. That's what it's about. It's about Christ. Not just his birth, although we're celebrating and remembering his birth. He wasn't born on December 25th. It's just the day that we've landed upon to celebrate it and to note it and to rejoice over it. So this year, I hope that our focus will be drawn to Jesus. To Jesus. In the passage that we read earlier, Deuteronomy 4 and Deuteronomy 6. What were some of the things that stood out to you from that passage? Do you remember that passage? We're to do what with our children? You can shout it out. I would bring out the microphone, but the microphone battery was dead. What are we to do with our children? We just stick them in front of the iPads and iPods and television and let the TV and the internet raise them? We're to teach them. We're to train them. We're to walk with them. We're to talk with them. We're to bring them into our homes, and we're to pass our faith on to our children and our children's children. When they come into your house, when they go out of your gates, when you lie down, when you rise up, when you're eating this meal, when you're having that meal, how intentional are we about passing the things that we believe, the traditions that we've come to embrace? How intentional are we about passing our beliefs and our faith on to our children through them? This year, will you celebrate Christ in Christmas? How many of you looked through the magazines to figure out how you should decorate your house this year? Anybody looked at any like Country Living or Pottery Barn? Everybody likes to go to the Pottery. All right, there is one. Pottery Barn always has great ideas. There's like that one house right on Main Street. They start decorating for Christmas, I think, in mid-June. You've seen that? Not Main Street. It's the 13. It looks like the mansion, and they got Christmas decorations galore. They could make the Pottery Barn. And what do you notice of all these pictures? Do you see your house? Do you see some of your traditions up there? Do you get the evergreen wreath going on your front door? Do you just have the streams of evergreen? Do you get those mechanical animals out in your yard acting like they just survived the deer season and they're happy? Do you hang stockings by the chimney with care? It fascinates me the numerous traditions that we have, and most of us don't realize where they come from. Most of us don't think too much about it. We just might say, oh, that's really cute, or that looks really fun. I'm going to incorporate that into my tradition, into my celebration, into my decoration. But here's my question. What is the message that you have taken care of to diligently pass along in your home? In Deuteronomy 4, Deuteronomy 6, God was very intentional about telling the Israelites, you, as my people, need to intentionally, diligently, carefully pass these things, all of the commandments, all the statutes, all the rules, all the things that I've told you. At the time it was just the 10 Commandments, but now we have all of God's Word. All of these things, it's your responsibility to pass on to the next generation. So do this in your homes. It should be written over your doorposts and on the side posts. It should be written on the front of your door. It should be decorating your fences and your gates. It should be over the hearth and the fire. It should be in your pictures. It should be on your knickknacks. What is the message that you, in your traditions, in your decorating, in your preparing, what is the message that you are passing on to anyone who comes through your doors? What are your Christmas traditions? What are your Christmas traditions? Now, I am going to ask a couple of you if you'd be so bold. I know, like the Judds, I saw your Facebook post. Is that a traditional thing that you do every year with your grandkids? You get them together and you make some of your holiday decorations, or is that just what you happen to do this year? Happens every year. So intentionally, you invite your grandkids over and you say, hey, Grandma needs to decorate and we don't want the work, so you put them to slave labor, right? You just say, do it however you want, decorate however you wish, and you just sit down over your coffee and cookies and watch them work. No, but it's good. You come alongside them, right? And you're working with them, and you're building a relationship. And are you telling many stories during that time? What are some other traditions that you do in your family? Post-Thanksgiving traditions, like this weekend that you just did maybe with your family, or maybe you wish that you could have done with your family. Pardon me? Make some lefse. Oh, good Scandinavians here. Oh, I love lefse. I have my roommate in college. We used to hunt up north way up north in Roseau, Minnesota, and his sister would make batches and batches of lefse every year, and she would sell it. And she would always make it during deer season because all the guys were out of the house. But every night we'd get to come home and get some warm, hot lefse. Oh, it was so good. I really wish my wife and daughter would learn how to make lefse. Other traditions. How many of you cut down your traditional, your own real Christmas tree? Anybody still do that? We're all wise in the room, aren't we? I was just talking with my family this morning. I said, did I ever do that with you guys? And Peter says, I don't ever remember it. But Ann seems to think that I did do it like once or twice. The problem with the real Christmas tree for me is that I'm allergic to trees and grass, and cats. And so when we first got married, I always did the mowing, and I would always have terrible allergies. And I got my wife 2 cats because she loved cats. I thought that was what husbands do, and I was miserable. And for the first number of years of our marriage, we would get real Christmas trees. And every holiday season, I was like this times 10. It was terrible. And it wasn't until, I think, a couple times with our kids that I realized it's the Christmas tree. I'm allergic to the real Christmas tree. But it's like, why on earth would you ever go cut down your own Christmas tree? It is only because it is some traditional feeling and thought. I was just at Fleet Farm the other day, and they had all natural, freshly cut Christmas trees for $19.99. And I'm like, that is a deal. Just go to Fleet Farm and buy your Christmas tree if you want a real one. You don't have to mess with hauling out into the snow. I love the picture of the guy. He's laying on the ground trying to cut the Christmas tree because he can't get in there. Dragging those Christmas trees. You end up with two in the one picture, right? They got two because the kids want one tree and mom wants the other tree. And I like the two newlyweds up there. There's the saw sitting in the background there right between his legs, if you see that. But yet he still thinks he's got to take the axe to it because that's what a real man, newlywed husband does, right? We get these pictures in our head, these ideals of what it could or should or must be that are usually oftentimes far from what the original intent, what the original ideal was. Why do we think that we need a Christmas tree? Why do we think that we need a Christmas tree to celebrate Jesus' birth? Have you ever asked yourself that question? Why do you think you need a real Christmas tree to celebrate Christ's birth? And why on earth would you go and chop it down yourself? I don't know. I'm not against Christmas trees. I just think that it's a curious question to ask. Why? And if we have a tree, if this is something that is important to us to include in our holiday celebrations, then why not make much about it as it points us to Christ? You see, in each of our homes this year, I'm sure we'll have our own Christmas tree. And on that Christmas tree will be many decorations. And plenty of people can come and go from your home, and they might look and they might admire, and they might say, oh, what a beautiful Christmas tree. And that might just be all that it is, just a decoration. If you come into our home, it's generally our Christmas tree is filled with lights, nativity, and the kids' decorations. Sometimes Ann wants to swing a few more decorations on there. Personally, I don't like all of my decorations on the tree because then at the end of the season, I have to take all of my decorations off. So I let the kids decorate. But if you come into our home and you see our Christmas tree, we'll end up talking about the various things that are on there. I did buy my wife, after we had to get rid of our two cats, I did buy her two Christmas ornaments, one for Simba and one for Nala. And Simba and Nala inevitably end up on our Christmas tree every year. So we tell the stories, the history of our family and cats and how Dad is allergic to cats. And that's why we don't have any cats and you don't get any pets. Sorry about that. Even though my daughter wants bunnies now for whatever crazy reason. But there's a message that gets expressed from our trees, the things that we value, the things that are important to us. Sometimes maybe it's a Christmas tree that my mother, when she decorates her Christmas tree, she has no more family decorations. It's the tree how she wants the tree. And it's a gorgeous tree with beautiful ornaments. And every piece of tinsel is hung with care. We like just to move tinsel around on her just to tease her. But she grew up with tinsel on her tree. And I'm like, why on earth would anyone put tinsel on their tree? What a mess. But we just do these things year after year after year without much meaning. And pretty soon it gets passed on from one generation to the next. As the story goes, there is a young daughter who was now preparing her Christmas dinner, her Christmas ham. And as she went to prepare her ham, she cut off the one end of the ham and she cut off the other end of the ham. She put it in the pan, she put it in the oven, and her husband said, honey, her newlywed husband, why did you cut off all that good meat? She's like, well, I don't know. It's just how my mother did it. It's a good question. She calls up her mom. She says, Mom, why did you always cut off one end and the other end of the ham and put it in the pan and put it in the oven? The mother goes, I don't know. It's a good question. That's just how your grandmother always did it. They call up the grandmother. The mother asked the grandmother, "Mom, why did you always cut off the ends of your ham? Like what is the meaning? What does it do?" And the grandmother was like, "Well, honey, the ham never fit in my pan, so I had to cut off the ends so that it would fit in the pan." And that's how sometimes traditions get started, right? It was just something that someone did out of a practical nature. There was just something that happened in years bygone that they only had an 8x8 pan. They didn't have the 9.5x11 pans. And so in order to make sure that the ham didn't drip everywhere, they cut it down to fit the size. And so they had a square ham for whatever reason. But these things get embedded into the DNA of our family and our history, and they get passed on from one generation to the next. Well, in the Gospel of Matthew, we read about the genealogy of Jesus. The genealogy of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. We're not going to read the whole genealogy, but here it traces us back to Jesus Christ being the son of David, the son of Abraham. Why does Matthew, in the very first verse of the Gospel of Matthew, make a note in the genealogy that Jesus is the son of David, the son of Abraham? Because there was this promise that was passed on from generation to generation. This promise that was given to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. This promise of a messianic king that would eventually come from the line of David. And when Matthew began to tell his nativity, his Advent story, he started with this promise because he knew that all of those that would be reading his letter one day or his book one day, they would hear this promise, the promise in the genealogy, the son of David, the son of Abraham. They would know and they would make this connection that Jesus is the fulfillment of this promise that has been passed on from generation to generation to generation, before they even had scrolls, before they even had written documents. This promise that was given, this promised seed, this promised one, this promised Messiah who would come and would lead Israel. And so here we see this king who would come and save his people from their sins. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 3, we see that this promise in the genealogy of Jesus goes way back to Adam. Traces it way back to that promise in the garden. Remember that promise in the garden? God gave a promise to Adam and Eve, even though they sinned, even though they committed the worst possible thing that they could do, disobeying God, eating from the one tree that they weren't supposed to eat from. God said, I'm going to give a seed. I'm going to give you a descendant. I'm going to send one who will crush this head of the serpent. The serpent will strike his heel, but he will crush the head of the serpent. He will overcome death. He will bring life everlasting. When we celebrate Christmas, do we remember this promise that goes back to the dawn of time? Do we remember that this was a promise that God gave to humanity of life over death, of one who would come and provide victory over sin and death? This promise that was laid out generation after generation after generation throughout all of the Old Testament. Do we see that it's all of those Old Testament prophecies that are finding their fulfillment in this one, in this baby, born, laid in a manger, born in Bethlehem? Do we remember that? Do we celebrate that? Or do we just cut straight to the presents? Right? What are the traditions that will be passed down for generations in your family? What are the things that you can do even now? You might think, oh, it's already all set in motion. No, not at all. Start new traditions. Say, this is what we're going to do. I'm starting a new tradition. I want to pass on to each of you my faith, the things that I've come to know and learn. You might be surprised at how much your family will appreciate it. You see, there are things as a family that we develop in our family by nature, right? We had a Thanksgiving celebration yesterday, and my dad proceeded to explain to everybody that we are all the same because we all come from him, and that's just the way that it is. And in one respect, he's correct. In the other respect, we're not all the same just because we all come from him. We're all alike because he nurtured and he shaped and he formed us in various ways. It was within the context of we have some adopted members of our family and siblings, and so he was trying to say how they're so different from the rest of us. And by this time, I'd already had a couple arguments with my dad, so I said, at the heart of it is this, Dad. I said, you've nurtured us this way. You've trained us. And it wasn't all negative, you know. You have to understand something about me and my family is that some of us thrive on, I call them discussions. You would call them arguments. But my wife believes they're arguments anyhow. We thrive on these conversations, but I was just trying to point out to him that there is some nature. We've just always done it this way because that's the way that we're wired, and that that's just the way that we are. Some of us are more loud and vocal and boisterous and argumentative. But maybe much of that was nurtured within us, right? Who can always tell the difference between what was in our nature and what was nurtured? We inevitably like to just blame it on nature. It's just the way that it's always been. It's just the way that it will always be. But I don't believe that that's always the case. Forever has been the debate, nature versus nurture. In your psychology classes, Cole, you'll get to that. Nature versus nurture. How much of it truly is just our DNA from our family tree, or how much of it is really nurtured by the way that our family interacted, by the things that we talked about, by the things that we didn't talk about, by the things that we would never talk about? I want to encourage you. Talk about these things. Teach these things. You don't have to be a master of theology, theologian, pastor, know the scriptures through and through. Talk about what you believe and who you believe Jesus to be, and pass these things on this Christmas. Begin to nurture a Christmas in your family. The Christmas tree traditions. How many of you have ever really thought about this too much? Why the Christmas tree? Anybody? I think about these things. I like to discuss, argue these things. Anyhow. Traditions are challenging things to find and to discover what was the root, what was the beginning. Where does the Christmas tree come from? A lot of people will debate and they'll claim that having Christmas trees or evergreen trees in your home is a purely pagan thing. I've been in plenty of those discussions, arguments, debates, and I think for those people that feel convicted about not having a Christmas tree, then so be it. Don't have your Christmas tree. For most of us, for the vast majority of us, we have by nurture or by nature said we're going to have a Christmas tree because that's how we celebrate Christmas. So, if we're going to have the Christmas tree, how do we make the Christmas tree about Christ, right? Well, I want to take us back to St. Boniface. Does anybody know who St. Boniface is? You see, one of the challenges is that sometimes we think of Catholics as Catholics, and we don't want anything to do with the Catholics. But St. Boniface lived from 675 AD to 754 AD. And at that time, there was only one church. There was no denominations. There was just one church. And St. Boniface, who later, I believe his real name is Winfred or Wilfred, he was just a godly man. He was a bishop that was serving. And he was a missionary to the Germanic peoples way back in 600, early 700 AD. A missionary to the German heathens, the hordes of those Germanic people that were pagans. And he came upon, as the fable, or as the story, as the legend holds, he came upon this community that was going to do a child sacrifice at the base of a giant ancient oak tree. And the community was offering up this child sacrifice to the god Thor. And St. Boniface, he got out his axe like that young newlywed husband that's going to chop down that Christmas tree for his newlywed wife. He got out his axe and he cut down this ancient oak tree. And as he's cutting it down, the winds and a storm came, and he didn't even get all the way through that oak tree, and it toppled the whole oak tree right over. He saved the child, and this whole community, in seeing this man take a stand against their God, against a pagan God, they all came to belief that this man's God was the true and the living God. And he set up a church there, and he trained them and he taught them. Well, lo and behold, at the place of where this giant oak tree had been taken down, a fir grew up in its place, or right next to the stump. And apparently, as the story goes, from that time forward, they began to call that fir tree the Christ tree. And so then they ended up including a fir tree or a Christmas tree in their Christmas time celebrations. Or I should rather say, when they began to celebrate the birth of Christ. Because it's still as hotly debated as when did Christmas actually really start. Another story or fable or legend is from the church reformer Martin Luther. If you're not familiar with who Martin Luther is, Martin Luther began to help the church step away from some of, the Catholic Church and believers step away from just that the priest is the only one who should be able to read the scripture, began to take a stand for getting the message out amongst the common people and not paying indulgences, and he was truly one of the first reformers. And again, I don't agree with everything that Martin Luther said. It's not because Martin Luther or the Lutherans are always right. It's just that at that time, he took a stand and said, sola scriptura, only God's word. We don't have to take the priest's word or the pope's word for it. We can take God's word directly for it. He said, sola gratia. It's only by God's grace. We don't have to do these indulgences. We don't have to do all these works to receive forgiveness. It's just by God's grace that we're forgiven. Sola fide, only by faith. It's not by works, lest any man should boast, but it's only by believing and trusting in what God has done alone. And it's sola Christus. It's only in Christ that we can be saved. It's not the church that saves us. Well, apparently Martin Luther was walking through the woods one day, and as he saw this fir tree out in the forest, and he saw the stars glimmering in the sky, he loved celebrating the birth of Christ. It reminded him of what was the scene or what was the view that those shepherds saw when all those angels appeared before them on that dark night. So he brought a fir tree into his house and he lit it up with candles so that his children and his wife could appreciate the scene as he began to retell the story of the angels visiting that flock of shepherds by night. Different people attribute different reasons to why they use the tree to celebrate the birth of Christ. And you can do some of your own research and discover some of these stories for yourself. But I encourage you to talk about these things. Talk about some of the traditions. Talk about what did Martin Luther care about? What was St. Boniface known for? I find it interesting that as St. Boniface took a stand against the idolatry in his community, it's very reminiscent of another one who chopped down a tree and took a stand against idolatry. Remember the story of Gideon? Gideon cut down a tree, the main tree, the Ashtaroth, in his community that they were worshiping. He cut it down as a stand for God against the idolatry in his neighborhood. Martin Luther took a stand against false religion in his time as well, calling people back to the Scriptures, calling people back to Christ, calling people back to faith by God's grace. Will we be willing to take such stands in our day and age, or will we just continue to embrace traditions without being careful to pass on what we believe to future generations? Some people like to make a statement that the evergreen or the pine tree is a pagan symbol and it's a pagan thing, and so we shouldn't use it in our homes. We shouldn't bring it into our homes. But this is what Isaiah chapter 55 has to say. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake his way, and let the unrighteous man forsake his thoughts. Let him return to the Lord so that he may have compassion on him, and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts are higher than your thoughts. For as the rain and the snow come down from heaven, and do not return there, but they water the earth, making it bring forth and sprout forth, giving seed to the sower and bread to the eater, so shall my word be that it goes out from my mouth. It shall not return to me empty, but it shall accomplish that which I purposed it for it, and it shall succeed in the thing for which I sent it. For you shall go out in joy, you shall be led forth in peace. The mountains and the hills before you shall break forth into singing, and all of the trees of the field shall clap their hands. Instead of the thorn shall come up a cypress, instead of the briar shall come up the myrtle. And it shall make a name for the Lord, an everlasting sign that shall not be cut off. Why do I bring up Isaiah 55? Did you hear that it talked about evergreens? It talks about the evergreens. The cypress and the myrtle are evergreen trees. They stay green all the time. And biblically, when they speak of these evergreens, these cypress and the myrtles, this evergreen tree has a connection to the everlasting sign that cannot be cut off. The evergreen magnifies the name of the Lord and his promises, his character, that his promise and his character is everlasting. And it's these trees that will break forth with shouting and singing. As you look at the pine trees, what do you think? What do you see? We went hunting this last week, and the guys and my boys who I was hunting with, they thought that I got lost. I wasn't lost. I knew exactly where I was. I was in a very thick woods in the middle of the wilderness of northern Wisconsin. I had left my cell phone at home, so I didn't have my satellite mapping to help me, but I did have my compass. But I got in the thickest part of the woods. And they all wanted me to change directions and head east. And I said, I don't want to head east, because I know how thick those woods were, and I didn't want to walk another 3/4 of a mile that direction. I'd already gone 3/4 miles the wrong direction. So I said, I'm going to keep going south. And as I looked to the south, I saw these tall pines off in the distance. And my only hope was to keep walking towards those tall pines. I had my compass, but I kept looking towards those tall pines. They pointed me the way out from the thick woods in which I had found myself embriared in. And I say that as those pine trees pointed the way out for me, the evergreen tree in our home can point us to something. Even in the bleakest winter, the evergreens are evergreen with life. When we see the evergreen, we're reminded that there is everlasting life, that even in the bleakest, darkest, deepest, coldest, worst time of the year, when you're stranded out in the middle of nowhere, God offers, God extends life everlasting. His promise is sure, even in the darkest, bleakest, coldest moments. his life endures to the end. And evergreens. Evergreens are forever rooted and standing. When they are forever rooted and standing, they will always point heavenward. I love this shape of the evergreen. You know, all the other trees, they get a little rounded. But these evergreens, they point us homeward. They point us to the way home of heaven. Do we trust God's everlasting, never-ending promises? The promise of our hope of eternity with him. You see, in the book of Genesis chapter 2, we read about a tree. Do you remember that tree? Chapter 2, verse 9. It's not the tree that was forbidden. It was the tree that was given. And out of the ground the Lord made to spring up every tree that is pleasant to the sight, and every tree that is good for food. The tree of life was in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God planted a tree in the middle of the garden that he wanted to take notice of. He wanted us to take notice that this is the tree of life, that if we just come to him, if we just obey him, if we just trust his word and his promise, he will give life everlasting. Then as well in the book of Revelation, you've heard me speak about these two trees before. The book of Revelation, chapter 22, we read this. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal and flowing from the throne of God and from the Lamb, through the middle of the street of the city, and also on either side of the river, the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of nations. All year round, this tree will produce fruit. It's evergreen. It's ever producing. It's everlasting. We have that tree in the Garden of Eden. We have the tree in the city of God. And then we have that tree in the middle. That tree that Christ was crucified upon. The tree upon which he gave his life. Now, I don't expect that everybody should have to put a cross in the middle of their Christmas tree, but I do find that this particular Christmas tree draws our attention to the right thing during this season. To celebrate Christ in Christmas this year. I exhort you and I encourage you with your many traditions. Find ways to pass on the things that you've come to know and love and believe. Maybe start some new traditions, some new ways that you can pass on to your beloved ones, your children and your children's children, and your children's children's children. I don't know, some of you probably have some great-grandchildren. What are the things that they're going to remember about you? Is it just going to be that you had a pretty tree in your house and lots of presents underneath? Or is it going to be that when they came to your home at Christmas, you celebrated Christ? The tree was a blast. The presents were a joy. The food was delicious. But what nurtured their soul was Christ.